For more than 2,000 years, the world believed it knew where one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world stood. Terraced gardens, rising in tiers above the rooftops of a desert city, watered by hidden machinery that defied the dry plains around it. Ancient writers called it impossible. Modern archaeologists spent 18 years digging for it, and they found almost nothing. That absence is the mystery at the center of this story. Not a war, not a betrayal, a blank space where one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world should be. If the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were real, why does the ground beneath Babylon refuse to confirm it? And if they were not real, how did a myth become so convincing that historians, kings, and archaeologists chased it for 2 millennia? To understand how this question even became possible, you have to start with what the ancient world actually said. The descriptions come almost entirely from Greek and Roman writers, none of whom saw the gardens themselves. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, described a structure rising in step terraces, planted with mature trees, supported on stone platforms strong enough to bear the weight of soil deep enough for root systems. Strabo described something similar. The Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus added more detail, and the Jewish historian Josephus, drawing on the lost writings of the Babylonian priest Berossus, placed the gardens inside the royal palace itself, built, according to the legend, by King Nebuchadnezzar II for his wife, who longed for the green hills of her homeland after settling in the flat, sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia. Modern historians treat this romantic motive with caution. It is the kind of detail ancient sources love to add, and it cannot be confirmed. What can be confirmed is the world that made this legend believable in the first place. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled in the 6th century BC, was not a myth. It was the most powerful city in the Near East, fresh off a series of military campaigns that had crushed rivals and absorbed territory across the region. Its walls were real. Its ziggurat was real. The Ishtar Gate, decorated with glazed blue brick and rows of sculpted animals, was real and still stands in reconstructed form in a Berlin museum today. This was a civilization that built at a scale meant to intimidate. A garden defying gravity and climate would have fit perfectly into that pattern. That is the key issue. The legend was not absurd. It was exactly the kind of thing this empire was capable of claiming. And it was not an isolated claim either. Mesopotamian kings had a long tradition of building elaborate palace gardens as displays of power. Assyrian rulers before Nebuchadnezzar, including Ashur-Nisir-Pal II and Sargon II, had constructed gardens specifically to project the idea that their kingship could reshape nature itself. So when later writers heard of impossible gardens connected to a Mesopotamian king, the story slotted into a pattern they already recognized. This is where the case for the Hanging Gardens starts to feel solid. But there is a problem, and it is not a small one. The Greek historian Herodotus visited the region in the 5th century BC and wrote extensively about Babylon. He described its walls in detail. He described its temples, its river, even its strange and specific customs. He never once mentioned the gardens. For a city he was actively trying to impress his readers with, this silence is difficult to explain if the gardens existed in the form later writers described. Most modern historians consider this absence the strongest single piece of evidence against the traditional story. If the most extravagant garden in the known world existed in Babylon during a period not far removed from his visit, it is strange that the writer most invested in describing Babylon's marvels said nothing about it at all. There is a second problem layered on top of the first. Most ancient descriptions claim the gardens drew their water directly from the Euphrates River. But after Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 BC, the course of the Euphrates was deliberately altered, moving the river's flow away from the old city center. By the time Greek and Roman writers were compiling their accounts, generations later, that water source would already have shifted or dried up near the supposed garden site. The geography itself stopped matching the story. This is where the real investigation begins, and where the story stops being simple folklore and becomes a genuine historical puzzle. In 1899, a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey began an excavation of Babylon that would continue for nearly 2 decades, interrupted only by the advance of a British army during the First World War. Koldewey was meticulous. He pioneered techniques for excavating mud brick structures that had crumbled into nearly unreadable layers of compacted earth. He uncovered the Ishtar Gate. He uncovered the ziggurat dedicated to the god Marduk, and in the northeast corner of the southern palace, he found something that excited him more than almost anything else: a vaulted, stone-built chamber with unusually thick walls and a cluster of nearby wells. Stone construction stood out immediately because almost everything else in Babylon had been built from sun-dried or oven-baked mud brick. Ancient texts had noted that only 2 locations in the city used stone. One was already identified. Koldewey believed he had found the other, and that it was the foundation of the gardens. At the time, this seemed like a breakthrough, but the evidence underneath it was thinner than it appeared. Cuneiform tablets recovered from the same chamber turned out to be administrative ration records, listing distributions of sesame oil, grain, dates, and spices. This was not the language of a royal garden. It was the language of a storeroom. Most scholars today believe Koldewey found a warehouse, not a wonder. He wanted the discovery badly enough to interpret ambiguous evidence in its favor, and he never fully retracted the claim during his lifetime. But the documentary record from Nebuchadnezzar's own reign, which is unusually detailed about his building projects, contains no mention of an elevated garden either. For a king who recorded his achievements extensively, that silence matters. So the traditional version of the story has 2 serious cracks. No physical structure confirmed, no contemporary text confirmed, and the most detailed eyewitness account of Babylon from the Right General era never mentions it at all. This is the point where most documentaries either give up or guess. But there is a more interesting explanation, and it comes from a different city entirely. In the early 1990s, Oxford scholar Stephanie Daly began re-examining cuneiform inscriptions from the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who ruled roughly a century before Nebuchadnezzar, from around 705 to 681 BC. Sennacherib had built a new capital at Nineveh, far to the north, and described it in his own inscriptions as a palace without rival. Among his boasts was a garden built deliberately to resemble a mountain range, planted with trees brought from distant regions, watered through a sophisticated system of canals, dams, and aqueducts that Daly estimated stretched across roughly 50 miles of engineered landscape. Most strikingly, Sennacherib described a water-raising mechanism using bronze and copper components, a device that functioned as an early ancestor of the screw pump later associated with Archimedes. Bas-reliefs recovered from Nineveh depict exactly this kind of elevated terraced garden, supported by visible aqueduct structures, centuries before the supposed construction of the Babylonian version. What matters here is the structural distinction. Standard Babylonian gardens were flat, irrigated through ground-level ditches, the ordinary method across Mesopotamia for centuries. Sennacherib's garden was different by design. It was built on artificial high ground, specifically to imitate a mountain, an unusual and labor-intensive choice that matches the ancient Greek descriptions of steppe terraces far more closely than anything found in Babylon itself. Building this kind of structure was not simply a matter of ambition. It required solving a logistics problem that flat irrigation never had to face: how to move river water uphill continuously without modern pumps. Sennacherib's solution combined large-scale canal engineering with a localized lifting mechanism at the garden itself, copper and bronze components turning within wells to draw water up to the terraces above. This is a meaningfully different category of construction than digging a ditch beside a riverbank. It demanded metalworking precision, hydraulic planning, and a workforce capable of executing both at once. That combination of stone terracing and mechanical water lifting is precisely the detail Greek writers seem to be describing centuries later, even though they attached it to the wrong city. Daly's theory is that the Greek and Roman writers, working centuries after the events and relying on second-hand and third-hand accounts, confused the 2 cities. This is not as strange as it sounds. Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC by a coalition that included the Babylonians, and after its fall, Babylon became the dominant symbol of Mesopotamian power in the wider world. The word Babylon itself was used loosely by some ancient writers as a regional label rather than a single specific city. Over centuries of retelling, a real Assyrian achievement may have drifted onto the more famous name, the way stories often migrate toward whichever civilization left the strongest impression. The empire that destroyed its rival also, eventually, may have inherited its legend. This theory does not erase the mystery, it transfers it. The Hanging Gardens remain the only one of the seven wonders whose location has never been confirmed by archaeology. Some historians find Dali's argument compelling because it solves the silence problem, explains the engineering details, and matches surviving inscriptions and artwork from Nineveh. Others remain cautious, noting that confirming a precise identification across a 2,000-year gap in evidence is extremely difficult, no matter how strong the circumstantial case looks. Whether every detail is exact or not, the larger pattern is important. Something like the Hanging Gardens probably did exist. The real debate is no longer whether ancient engineers could imagine an impossible garden. It is which empire actually built it, and why history gave the credit to the wrong city. That is, in the end, what makes the story worth telling. Not a wonder that vanished, but a reminder of how fragile historical memory really is. A real engineering achievement recorded in stone by the people who built it may have been quietly absorbed into the legend of a more famous rival, simply because fame outlives accuracy. The Hanging Gardens may not be a myth at all. They may simply be misfiled. If you enjoyed this look at one of history's most stubborn mysteries, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the ancient world. And I'd like to know what you think. Do you believe the Hanging Gardens stood in Babylon, in Nineveh, or somewhere history has yet to uncover? Let me know in the comments below.